Welcome everyone to Science Society, and of course, a special welcome to you, Stephen. And let me give the audience just a very brief overview about you, so they get to know you a little bit. Dr. Stephen Allison, he's a professor of ecology and evolutionary biology and Earth System Science at the University of California, Irvine. Sorry, and I shared the lab website in the chat for people who would like to check it out. Also in the future, and he's Bachelor of Science and biology at the Penn State University, and then his PhD at Stanford University. And later on, he worked also at the NOAA Climate and Global Change as a postdoc. He was their postdoctoral scholar. And welcome. Thank you so much for coming. And our first question usually is, when did you kind of discover that you have this affinity or passion for science and that you would want to make kind of a life career out of it? Was it something like a childhood dream, or was there some class, or maybe a trip to a museum? Whatever the story is, I think it's really interesting for people to learn. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Katerina. Thanks for inviting me to be here with you all today. My story, I think, goes way back to when I was a kid, and my parents every summer would take me and my sister out to, some exotic or interesting destination, often a national park. When we were really little, we started, closer by. So I grew up on the East Coast, and we would go up to Maine, to like Acadia National Park, or the Great Smoky Mountains down in Tennessee, North Carolina. Eventually, making longer trips out west to the Rockies, California, Pacific Northwest. We went to Alaska when I was a teenager. So I had this really nice exposure to natural environments, national parks, these really iconic ecosystems around the world. And I think that definitely inspired me to kind of go down the route of biology and environmental science. And then when I was in high school, I had a really unique opportunity to go to the U.S. Virgin Islands with a AP biology class. And they had a history of going to the Virgin Islands and working on counting reef animals. There was a hurricane in 1989. And after that hurricane, the classes would go down every year and kind of monitor the resilience and the recovery of the reef from that hurricane. And they kept doing that class and that trip for many years after. So it was nice to see that somebody from kind of rural Pennsylvania could have the chance to go and experience that really amazing environment and think about, at that time, climate change was not as much in the forefront, but we were already thinking about disturbance and the human impacts on the environment. And then I went to college and majored in biology. And at that point, did undergraduate research, kind of developed the plans for research and the interest that I have now. And went to graduate school and ecosystem ecology, and so that kind of is where the story ends, or where it leads to.
Well, that's a beautiful story that these out of school trips and events kind of guided you towards what you really like to do and love. I think about that too during the summer for my kids and also other people, that it's kind of a different way of learning, a more free one. And I think that kind of allows kids more to like discover what they like to do. Um, it's really interesting. So yeah, that's wonderful that you had these opportunities, and that led to this in the end to this research. And could you guide us a little bit to that, like how you came to work on this project that we are talking about today, and maybe if there's kind of a peek behind the curtain, was it easy to get funding for this, or was it really hard, or and to collaborate with people? If you any kind of background story you could give us, that would be really interesting. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, and just to say, the topic that we're talking about today is the impact of drought on microbes in soil and the resulting effects on carbon storage in soil, which is really an important topic today with climate change altering so much of our environment and drought being a part of that climate change, especially here in California, where I'm based right now. And we're really interested or concerned, I guess, in some ways about how climate change is going to affect all these aspects of our environment and our landscapes, ranging from the plants that grow there to the microbes and microbiomes that live in the soil that we may not see, but play these really important roles in our ecosystems. So that's the topic of the paper, and we can get into that in more detail later. But that line of research has been inspired by the need to understand these responses, the need to know, what's going to happen in the future. How can we use scientific research, mathematical models, people's lived experiences, our next generation of students? How can we all come together to address these really important questions about what our world is going to look like in the future, so that we can make good decisions about how we can, use energy and avoid climate change or deal with or adapt to the impacts. So there's kind of a broader context there. The work that's recently published is an outcome of research that's been funded by the Department of Energy and the National Science Foundation, and we've been working on questions about drought, climate change, and microbes in the soil since probably 2010. And a lot of that's been locally based here in California, but we have a recent project with collaborators from Michigan State and North Carolina State University. That's Sarah Evans and Christine Hawks. And that study actually is global. So we are collaborating with teams around the world who are asking similar questions. How does drought affect ecosystems? How does it affect soils and microbes? And they've actually sent us samples from around the world. We're analyzing those and doing measurements, testing the resilience of the microbes in soils that have been exposed to experimental drought and those that have not, and doing comparisons. So that, there's a whole experimental context, and I try to synthesize that information that we've learned over those past decades and with our current project, and come up with a hypothesis or some ideas about how microbes might change the carbon cycle in soil as they experience drought. So it's an outcome of a synthesis of a longer term, larger body of work.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Also, that kind of in general, we hear now more or read more publications that are investigating microbes in general. So it's really interesting that it happens kind of at the same time and on all kind of organisms and environments, like ourselves as an environment, and also in the soil, and now under different conditions. We had last year a speaker talking about after super heat fires, like not just a general fire, but before and after this very severe fires in California. And he shared the research, and you. So, did it need kind of a basic knowledge before from all these different fields that this could, turn into reality, this research? Or is it just, do you think, coincidence? Or was some technology development that maybe became cheap enough that kind of is enabling all this research? What do you think?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of stars that have aligned to make it possible to uncover what was originally called the microbial black box. Almost from an engineering standpoint, that there's some process or machine that is contained within a black box. We don't know how it works exactly. We know it's important. Things go into the box, things come out of the box, but we don't know what's going on inside. And so that was sort of microbial ecology and environmental change impacts on microbes 20 years ago. But since then, we had the Human Genome Project. We had massive advances in sequencing technology. So we have the capacity now to very, very cheaply and quickly sequence trillions of DNA sequences, or the letters of the DNA sequence. And that's really revolutionized pretty much all of biology, but especially microbial ecology. Because before, we were dependent on isolating microbes from the environment or culturing them in the laboratory, looking at them under microscopes. And all those techniques are important, but they have challenges, and they don't have a whole lot of resolution, or we can't see everything inside that black box. So the sequencing revolution and associated technologies, for DNA synthesis, making primers, for the bioinformatics, the computational analysis that we do after acquiring billions and billions of sequences, all that's made it possible to do ecology at a much larger scale with microbes. Even though they're small scale, we can ask questions about the global distribution of microbes based on the presence of their sequences. And we can go beyond sequencing now, and I think there's been this revolution in sequencing, and so people basically sequence the heck out of the environment between 2005 and 2020, in the past years. We're still doing it, but now there's also interest in going beyond that, using other advanced molecular techniques, mostly which have had a biomedical origin, but techniques like transcriptomics, metabolomics, proteomics, interactomics. So basically looking at all of the levels of the biological hierarchy, from genes to RNA to proteins to metabolites and the functioning. And so we can combine all of that technological power to ask questions about how does climate change or how does drought affect a microbial community, an entire microbiome at all of those levels. And so one of the things I tried to do in that article that was published recently is to synthesize how microbes respond to drought with all those different mechanisms, from their genes to their metabolism, and also how they might evolve, and which is an area of active research. We don't know the answer to that yet, but with these techniques, I think we'll be able to get some answers, in the next few years. And I suspect that microbes are evolving all the time, and they're evolving everywhere, and that's one of the reasons why they're going to be resilient to these environmental shocks. So you mentioned the wildfire before. That's another key impact of climate change. So droughts and fires, floods, things like that. There are all these ways, including evolution, that microbiomes can respond to those shocks and those perturbations. They've been doing it for billions of years, literally. So we should expect that they're going to keep doing that.
Yeah, thank you for that overview. And I totally agree with you. So So going now into your paper and the the recent publication, what was then the main finding of your study?
The main result there is that we have to be aware of the balance between microbial responses, microbiomes, and plants, because we have to understand how that balance might change with climate impacts like drought. So I want to start out by saying microbes are good, especially those that live out in the environment. On the whole, microbes and the communities or microbiomes that they live in are critically essential for our well-being, for the well-being of the entire planet and all of its great cycles and processes. We couldn't live without microbes, especially microbes in soil. So I don't want to throw microbes under the bus. But the conclusion of the paper is that we have to be aware that those beneficial microbes are living in a balance with other parts of the environment, including the plants, including the climate. And so, as I just described, if microbes are extremely adaptable and resilient and well equipped biologically to cope with something like drought, then they may be able to maintain their functions, their benefits to the system, despite these climate problems. And usually that would be good, right? Because microbes are involved in helping plants grow. They're involved in releasing nutrients in soils. For our gut health, they play an important role. So microbes do all these really important beneficial things. But one of the things that they also do is to release carbon back to the atmosphere. So if we think about the carbon cycle broadly, you have carbon coming in to an ecosystem or to a soil through photosynthesis and plant growth. So that's how carbon enters. And then it sticks around in the soil for some period of time. And then the other part of the cycle is that the microbes, the ones that live in soil, consume that plant material after the plants die usually, and they release it back to the atmosphere ultimately as carbon dioxide. And then plants, they do photosynthesis, they take up that carbon dioxide, and the cycle is completed. So in sort of an unimpacted world without climate change, the amount of carbon coming into a soil is about equal to the amount going out. And the amount of carbon that stays in the soil is fairly stable. A lot of the carbon in soils can be thousands of years old, so it's been around for a while. And we want to keep it there. That's carbon that is contributing to climate mitigation, and it's also contributing to soil health, maybe plant growth and crop growth. So if we tip the balance towards the microbes, say if a drought reduces the growth of plants dramatically, but the microbes continue doing what they're doing, then we might push that balance towards losing carbon from soil. And that's the concern that I raise in the paper. We wouldn't want to live without the microbes in soil. We need their functioning in order to keep that cycle going. But if we change the balance in that cycle, that could result in an unexpected loss of carbon from soil and make more of the world look like a desert soil or some other arid environment where we don't see as much carbon that persists in the soil.
Yeah, I thank you for sharing that. And yeah, I think this is so important, this research. And so how do you then think that the climate change we are observing, that is not going away anytime soon, is affecting the impact on the microbes and then the soils, for and then did you study this, Can you make predictions also for different kind of soil types in the future? Thank you.
Yeah, of course. So that's a really important point. We expect that different soils, especially in climates that have a wide range of different rainfall, are going to respond to a drought differently, right? So here in California, we have a drought pretty much every summer. We have a lot of variation from year to year in rainfall. So this past winter, for example, you probably saw on the national news that there was tremendous snowfall in the mountains, even here in Southern California. Um, we had a lot of rain. We had flooding. The Central Valley is like starting to fill up with an ancient lake. So this year was a really, really wet year. In contrast, if you look back to 2012 to 2015, we had a historically severe drought, well below average rainfall for 3 or 4 years, and that is really exemplifying the variation in climate that we see, and a lot of that was probably just natural variation. Climate change adds to the extremes, but California has just got a naturally variable climate, and so in systems like that encounter drought fairly frequently, maybe the balance is not as easy to tip. We might see those systems, the microbes and maybe the plants as well, can tolerate those climate shocks better. But I would worry about places that are wetter. So, for example, the Amazon basin. There's been discussion amongst Earth system scientists that we could, because the Amazon is so large that it generates its own weather and has its own water cycle, that if climate change dries out the Amazon enough that trees start dying, that's going to trigger a vicious cycle of more tree death, lower precipitation, lower rainfall, and declining stocks of carbon, both in the plants above ground and maybe also in the soils, as the microbes continue to release carbon from soil. So in that case, in a wet environment that's not accustomed to drought, you might actually see bigger impacts and greater losses of soil carbon. And there are ways that we can use data on the climate records, the types of plants that are present, the microbial communities, and put those variables into a mathematical model, and then maybe make some predictions. So that's how you deal with the dependence of results on specific places or specific environments. You just need to capture all that variation with a global model. And so a lot of our work these days is thinking about making that connection. So understanding the local context, understanding the principles or rules that guide the microbial process in that place, and then using a mathematical model to extend that to a much larger scale.
Yeah, it's really interesting, to think of these different environments. I haven't thought. When you hear about that, you think more of where droughts occur very often. But yeah, if you think of a place that has a very constant climate for a prolonged time, there, these insoles will make the biggest change. And how do you think then the systems adapt, and why do you think, or how will it change basically the environment, and then also carbon capture? Do you think that that change will stay, or do you think the microbes that are there that capture more carbon will bounce back, or do you think it will just, from studying maybe different type of climates, do you think they have naturally the ability to bounce back, or do you think it will stay that way and we as humans have to kind of help them out with, bioengineering? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. I think that we don't fully know yet, and that's an area of active research because there's the balance I mentioned before between plants that add new carbon to the soil and some microbes that then consume that plant carbon and release it. But there are also microbes in the soil that will help to store carbon because they produce resistant body parts like cell walls, or they produce this slime called extracellular polysaccharides, basically a biofilm. So some of them make biofilms to protect themselves from drought, and then that biofilm can actually help store carbon, can help glue the soil together, make it resist erosion. So there are different roles for microbes in the soil. So they're not necessarily all contributing as much to the loss of carbon. Some of them are contributing to carbon storage, and that is an area of active investigation. So figuring out which microbes in a very complex community and in different environments are most abundant, which ones respond positively or negatively to drought, and then trying to, as we were discussing before, scale up those differences to the continent or global level. So that's a lot of the active research right now, because there is the hope that yeah, maybe in some of these places the resilient microbes are the ones that help store carbon, and that the way that they're resilient to drought is by making these slimes or biofilms and resistant body parts that can then add carbon and keep it in the soil longer. Now, another thing that microbes do, which could be really beneficial if they adapt, is that they engage in symbioses with plants. So the plants, we think, are going to be, and we know that plants are impacted by drought, right? If it's too dry, the plants have to close the pores in their leaves and they can't do photosynthesis. But one thing that microbes can do is to help plants acquire water directly. So there are fungi that move through the soil and acquire water and may transfer some of that water to their plant hosts. There are beneficial bacteria that may grow with plant roots or plant leaves that help the plant tolerate drought more effectively. They may help the plant get nutrients more efficiently. They may help the plant resist pathogens. So there's lots of ways that microbes help plants, and that those ways may help the plants also be more resistant or resilient to drought. So we have to figure out, how are all of those different types of microbes, the ones that are symbiotic with plants, the ones that store carbon, the ones that release carbon, how are they all changing with a climate change like drought? And then how do we add that up to look at the net impact on the soil? And then we can say, is that going to be a long-term change? Is it as a short-term change? And basically, will they bounce back or not? But I guess the upshot here is that microbes are going to be fine. That somebody's going to persist and survive and recover from drought, and it's just a matter of which microbes are they and what are they doing in the environment, and is that good news or is that a problem for plants and for us who rely on microbes for these benefits?
Yeah, it's yeah, I'm sure they will be fine, just us. And we consist of many microbes, so part of us will continue anyways, I guess. But and then how exactly do you study the microbes in the soil, and also then the effects of the environmental changes? If you want to elaborate a little bit more how you and your team study these. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, we analyze microbes with a range of different techniques, from those molecular approaches like DNA sequencing that I was mentioning earlier, all the way to global scale mathematical and computer models. But I think I'll just elaborate a little bit on some of the field techniques, the research techniques that we use out in the landscape, because I think those are the exciting and interesting methods that we're using right now, and they give me a chance to get out into the natural environment and look at these ecosystems that are actively responding to climate change. So here in Southern California, we have a long-term experiment where since 2007, we've been simulating drought as well as other changes like nitrogen pollution and even added precipitation. So manipulating these environmental factors in two of our sort of iconic California ecosystems, grasslands and coastal sage scrub, which is like a shrubland. There's bushes, kind of medium-sized bushes around. And in those systems, we have a gigantic experiment that prevents water from hitting these plots that are experiencing drought as a result of that manipulation. In order to do that, we watch the weather forecast, and when it looks like it's going to rain, especially if it's going to rain a substantial amount, then we organize a crew of students and researchers to go out and cover these experimental plots with a sheet of plastic, which is up on a metal frame, and then we prevent the water from entering that plot for that particular storm. And the goal is to exclude about 40% of the rainfall that would naturally occur. And then we have control plots that don't receive that manipulation. And like I said, we have plots that receive nitrogen or not, and we have these replicated in the shrubland and the grassland. So we can basically tell how is drought going to affect the plants, the microbes, the soils, the hydrology of these two different iconic ecosystems in the California landscapes. So that's our broad context for understanding the ecological response to drought. And then we do smaller experiments within that larger field experiment. So one of the things that we've done is to take microbes that have been living in that drought treatment for many years, and we can move them around. We can take microbes that have been living in the control environment, the kind of ambient normal environment, and we can move them into the drought and see how they respond. So we've done those kinds of transplant experiments where we take a microbiome adapted to one environment and we put it into a different environment. And so you might find that familiar if you've heard of the fecal transplant technique, which is a health intervention for people with problems in their gut microbiome. So you can actually re-inoculate their guts with a healthy microbiome and see if that improves their health outcomes. So we can basically do a similar approach. We can take a microbiome from a drought environment and one from a natural unmanipulated climate environment, and then move them around to the other environment and see how they perform. And to look at their performance, we measure their DNA sequences so we can see which particular taxonomic groups of microbes, which species essentially are increasing or decreasing in their populations with that movement. And we've done studies on their RNA, so what genes are they actually expressing, and are those genes related to drought response? We've looked at their metabolism, which metabolites are they producing? Are they producing these exopolysaccharides? Are they producing compounds that help them resist the drought and survive the desiccating hot, dry conditions? And then we compare those responses across our different drought treatments, precipitation amounts, and the two different vegetation types. So that's basically what we do here. And there are other people, like I said, with this global scale project that are doing that in other places in the world where they have their own experimental drought simulations, and then they measure the plants and they measure the the soils or the microbes. And so once we get enough of those studies, then I think we'll have a pretty good picture of how the whole planet might respond. Although there are still gaps in our knowledge, it's really hard to do a manipulation in a tropical rainforest, for example, because you can't block the rainfall from the top down. The trees are 300 feet tall. So we work in a system where we can put a cover over the whole plant community because the plants are only maybe 10 or 20 feet high at the tallest. But that's the approach we've chosen to use in our system, and because it's been going on for so long, since 2007, we now can see in the long run how the plants respond and how the microbes respond. We have started to see evidence that in our system the carbon stocks in the soil are declining with drought. So the kind of warning that I made in the paper, it does seem to be valid, at least in our system, even though it is fairly experienced with drought. The amount of additional stress we put on that system does seem to impact the carbon in the soil. Not a huge amount yet, but it's starting to be noticeable.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that explanation about how you study these. And it's really interesting that you have this very controlled environments, basically, um, that you can then manipulate how you would like. And yeah, I so is there a lot of, you mentioned, the more data we get from around the world, the better we can make the predictions. Is the rate of data coming in increasing? And are people using like technologies like machine learning and so on to integrate all that data? And do you think the models, like, what is the rate of the models being basically reliable enough that we can really, rely on them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question, and the answer is yes. There's a lot of work in this area, and I think it's growing exponentially. There are more and more junior scientists going into the field of global change biology, microbial ecology all the time. So we're definitely seeing an explosion of interest and data in these fields. And I'll credit my funding agencies, the Department of Energy and the National Science Foundation. They've been very active in funding this research, which is great to see. Also, agencies like NASA that generate satellite imagery has been really important for scaling up some of these results and integrating with the responses of plants, for example. So there's a lot of investment in this field. There's even private companies now that are interested, and so I think there's a lot of resources going into it. We still have a big challenge though with what to do with all of the data. And you mentioned machine learning and AI techniques, and those are definitely coming online. There's a lot of interest in that, and there's a lot of opportunity to borrow from the machine learning disciplines to answer some of these questions and to really mine the data, the large data sets for patterns. At the same time, I think there's a disciplinary gap here, and people who are trained in field ecology are probably not the ones who are like up on random forest or neural networks or whatever the techniques are in machine learning. And so we have a lot of work to do in scaling and talking across disciplines where we can get the people who understand the biology of the system integrated with the people who can write the code to mine the data, and to do that with the right ecological questions in mind. So I think we kind of have a challenge or a bottleneck now where there's so much data and there's so much promise in machine learning, but we haven't really put them all together yet. And then there's another sort of knowledge gap between those techniques and the computer models, so our simulations of the future state of the planet and the climate. And that's an area also that's received quite a bit of investment, but it's a huge challenge. We need more investment there. And I think probably our investment in sequencing and generating data at the scale of individual landscapes or oceans or bodies of water, like that's pretty good. But we need some more investment in integrating that data and generating a kind of flow of information from those data sets, through machine learning techniques, through mathematical models, and into our predictions that ultimately are used by society, used by decision makers. And I think we kind of are missing some investment at that higher level.
Yeah, I know where you're coming from because a collaboration I worked in for doing more genomic and sequencing and epigenetic sequencing of different type of neurons in the brain under different health conditions. We couldn't find people that were willing to take the pay that NIH give for doing data science and prediction, because good people, they get, I don't know, 4 times the money from a financial company or something like that. So it's really hard unless you waive with the visa, but that was almost impossible during COVID times.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think there's also this problem, right? That people, especially in this field of data science, just we can't compete with the payment they are used to. I would say, unless, yeah, as I said, you can help people get a green card in the future in the US. But I don't know if you see that also very practical issue, which I think might be short term because of the improvements and developments of non-coding technologies, including AIs like ChatGTP, that will maybe improve that situation, because we won't maybe need actual humans, so many at least, to do the actual work of programming and so on. We will need maybe one person to check the work. What do you think? Do you think this technologies hold promise for research?
Yeah, I think they do. Maybe not in the way exactly that you're describing, just because I think the machine learning models like ChatGPT have to be trained. And, I can see why you can train them very well to replicate certain tasks or to perform certain tasks. But I wonder, or I question if they, can really be that useful in replacing the thought process of unpacking a complex adaptive system like the coupled climate Earth system and biological systems. So I think there's ways to use them, and like you said, maybe for generating code. When there is a scientific concept or a hypothesis, that you can have the bot write the code as long as you can specify what you want very clearly. And I think that's going to make some knowledge more accessible. It's going to make it maybe easier for people to engage with each other. But I don't think we're at a point yet where AI is going to be able to replace our scientific ability to sort of pose the questions and look at the analysis of very complex systems, which we don't understand them well enough to train an AI to get an answer. I guess is what I'm saying. That the AI works really well when we have like a repetitive task, or like a computational task that there's a good training data set available, right? Like a code base for system models. Yeah, a machine could easily parse all of that and probably help with the coding, and that would be valuable because these larger scale models, our predictive models, are pretty impenetrable for somebody who's not a real technical expert in that field. So if AI could help us overcome that that barrier, that would be really helpful. But I still think we would need to invest more in the next generation to apply those AI tools, and really be thinking about what's the right area to allocate our effort. What is the overall conceptual model of how the planet works, and how everything from microbes to plants, animals, and people interact in the context of climate change. So I think there's still some challenges there, but yeah, the AI could be really helpful.
Yeah, another idea that some people pursue is to open it up like for the general public and see what comes out of it. Like, there are coders out there that in their free time like to work on challenges like this in kind of a gamified way, maybe. Are there people doing that maybe to put, stuff out there and ask the general public, can you help us out? And then you will be mentioned in the paper or something. I don't know if you know that, what's the name? The pitch drop, where everyone looked at the video when the actual drop will happen in Australia.
Mm.
There were in history like projects like this, because the guy that was doing that experiment, that drop takes like decades to drop, and every time, the few times that thing dropped in his life, he was always staring at it, but whenever it dropped, he wasn't there. So that's how he then opened it up. He had the webcam, and everyone around the world could watch it drop, and then yeah, and then the person that was online was then mentioned in the paper. But but there are more examples like this. Like, is there maybe an approach, or do you think that wouldn't be worth the effort? What would come out of it?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think there's definitely a place for that kind of crowdsourcing of science. Again, because of the complexity and technicality and uncertainty of the coupled climate Earth system, I don't know that that's the place I would start. Maybe with like parsing patterns in molecular data sets, or if you had a very specific question, I could see that being a useful approach. But I think where I want to see more investment is in training the next generation, right? From everything from the graduate student level, which is more technical training in science and interdisciplinary skills, all the way to engaging with the communities who are impacted by climate change, and may have their own questions and concerns that we're not necessarily addressing right now. And that if we could get more of the public behind us and supportive of making these investments, or actually participating in the research process, like I think what your broader point would be, that how can we involve people, real people, everyday people, in tackling this problem. And I think there's a lot of ways that we can do that. One of the areas that I've been interested in increasingly lately is engaging with communities, often those that don't have historically much of a voice in the design of science or research, and trying to engage them as thinkers, right? Not as just recipients of our knowledge that we've created in the ivory tower, but as people who have lived experiences with especially the impacts of climate change, or the impacts of health outcomes that relate to microbes, and asking them, what do you think? What is important to you? What are your needs? And how can we together design a question or design a research project? And then they kind of participate in that process throughout, and then they're co-authors on the paper, because they were the ones who served like as the principal investigators. So I think that there's good reason to make those kinds of investments and think about, well, how can we broaden the inclusion of people in the scientific enterprise in ways that we haven't really tried to do recently or historically.
Yeah, that's really wonderful that you do that. And I've seen a really positive kind of start this maybe to hopefully become a trend, for people to do that, for researchers to do that. We had um, um, ancestry, basically research team that here that basically gave back identity to former slaves cemeteries, and
Mm-hmm.
they actively really involved the public or the descendants in those areas. I think it's North Carolina and South Carolina, and so which was really wonderful. And they did this naming ceremonies, and they really just did the research that that people wanted them to do on the remains. So it was a that came to be a really wonderful and very well received research project. And I think that's so important that you do that, because I think a lot of things we wouldn't think of that is really important to improve people's lives, also in clinical studies, to more actively ask people, what do you need to be solved from us and addressed, and like to have this very practical approach. So yeah, congratulations for doing that. That's really wonderful. And what is basically the future for your research? If you could give us like a peek into the future, what you're working on now. Thank you.
Yeah, we have a lot of exciting work going on in this area. Um, One area for the microbial scale is really trying to leverage all of that molecular data, all the sequences we have around the world, and even from our own studies, because there's so much embodied knowledge there and potentially answers to important questions, and we just have to invest in the people and the time to extract that information. So we're putting together a team to look at genomic data, from environmental samples and from isolated strains of microbes, lab isolates, and basically putting all that information to a giant database and then running computational pipelines to extract useful information from that. And then we kind of pass that along up in scale, so we go from a microbiome or a set of genomes to our experimental plots, maybe in the field site, and then pass that information along in a mathematical way to make a prediction about the response to drought or to different moisture levels, and then we can pass that information along to a ecosystem or earth system scale, a global scale model. So we're really focused now on taking the information we have in molecular and other small scale data sets and scaling that up, parsing it out into useful information that helps us improve our predictions. So that's one area of interest. Another area is really focused at the global scale and thinking about what are the tipping points in the climate system that relate to microbes and soil carbon. Are we missing some potential danger in terms of climate feedbacks or losses of carbon? I mentioned the Amazon basin before, so is that something we need to pay closer attention to? This recent article on drought and its impacts on soil carbon. There are issues potentially with warming in the high latitudes in the Arctic. Is that going to melt permafrost? Is that going to change our microbial balance up in those places that store about a third of the world's soil carbon? And so I'm involved with a team that's going to be looking at that and revising our Earth system models to account for some of those potential tipping points or danger zones in the future. And then, yeah, another area that I'm excited about is we were just talking about is related to engaging communities, especially those that have been historically excluded from our our scientific process and trying to build research justice principles into our science, and recognizing the scholars, out there in the social sciences and humanities and in our own scientific fields who are already trying to do this, and kind of giving them the resources and networks to boost that pursuit, and to engage with their communities to do this co-design process where we're trying to be more inclusive about who is in charge of the research enterprise. So it's not just academics, and not just federally funded researchers, but that everyone, especially those who are most impacted by climate change, can have a say and play a role in addressing the problem.
Yeah, that is all really important work. And do you think, or do you think politicians and lawmakers, people that can actually implement regulations, are they listening more to studies like this? Is that improving, or is there still a long way to go, because we probably don't have a long time? I know we had a researcher here that looks into zooplankton and so on in the ocean, and he said that they had kind of a recent win, that internationally there were now regulations to protect the ocean and different regions of the ocean, to make basically larger natural preserves in the ocean. And that was kind of a win for them, that their research kind of contributed to that. So are things like this happening, or is that still too new, and politicians are not aware yet of these kind of implications? Because we need to recalculate basically our carbon release and models probably, and then regulation, how much we have to cut, and even do other carbon capture approach, or use other carbon capture approaches.
Yeah, I think there is a lot of progress there. I think that even nationally and globally, which is the most challenging scale to develop policy, we've seen a shift towards even conservatives or people who have historically been resistant to climate action. I think at least accepting that there's a problem, accepting that that there's a scientific consensus, and now the debate is more about what is the appropriate response, what are the appropriate solutions, and how much are they going to cost, and who's going to be responsible for those. So I think that there has been some progress there, in that now we are a little bit more focused on the policy questions. I don't personally think the policy movement at the national scale is fast enough, and most scientists would agree that the problem is urgent, and we're not reacting quickly enough to deal with that urgency. But that's where I lately have been looking more at the local levels or regional levels. So living in California, California is very advanced in its climate action policy. There's a lot of regulations and investments kind of embedded in the bureaucracy of California, which is a giant economy and our largest state economy in the country. So there, the challenge is really like doing it efficiently and showing how we can use California as a test bed and an exemplar for effective climate policy, because like we have the political will to do things here. It's just making them effective is still a challenge. But it is nice as an academic in my privileged position. I have access to talk with policymakers, members of Congress, the Orange County supervisors. My colleague was elected to the city council in Irvine in 2022. So we do have that opportunity, I think, for scientists to engage with policymakers directly, and that's something that we have to work on and be cautious about, but that it's worth investing some time and effort in making those connections. And I do think at the local level, for example, here in Irvine, we're putting together what would be Orange County's first climate action adaptation plan for any city in the county, and that's exciting. Irvine's a big city; it's 330,000 people. It's in Orange County, which has an interesting political history that was conservative and has shifted to be more moderate now, and could be a good test bed for some policies and some action that address climate change and make meaningful contributions to mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, and also like show us how again our communities and societies can be adapting to the change that's already baked in.
Yeah, that sounds really promising. And you know, Serena is not here, but she usually points out that it usually works and gets adapted if it cut costs or makes things more efficient, and people can also profit from it. So, do you think the research into the microbes and maybe resulting bioengineering would hold the possibility for agriculture and different companies that supply seed soils and so on to use the research to kind of make agriculture more profitable, and also maybe gardening, in everyday's people, because we destroy our microbes in our backyards by spraying it with all kinds of chemicals to make the lawn prettier and so on. Would Do you think your research holds promise for that, so it gets adapted independently also from policymakers and like political environments?
Yeah, I think that's a good point, that there's a lot of potential for private industry to make progress here. There's different motivations, right? There's profit motivations for corporations and agribusiness. There's also societal challenges, grand challenges, and food security and climate adaptation that we want to think about. Ideally, those profit motives align with the societal needs. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But I think it's definitely true that there are a lot of companies in agricultural industry that are looking at ways to leverage microbes and microbiomes to increase crop yields, to increase crop resilience to climate change. Some of this is, government-funded research, USDA, Department of Energy for biofuel crops, et cetera. So yeah, that's a huge industry. It's probably going to be in the billions of dollars pretty quickly. So the challenge there is just to make sure that whatever interventions and technologies are being developed and marketed are actually effective and not making the climate problem worse, and they're actually again achieving these societal goals and addressing grand challenges in food security, and not just increasing profits for agribusiness. So that's an ongoing challenge, of course, with industry. But I think that the people on the scale of their urban gardens, like that's also a relevant application of this kind of information, right? If we can say to people, oh yeah, you don't want to use this type of fertilizer or this type of pesticide or herbicide because it has this impact on the microbiomes and the wildlife or the plants, then that's useful information. Maybe there's health implications too, right? Like if that's the source of your gut microbiome, you might not want to be using antibiotics in a certain way because antibiotic resistance or other concerns like that. So I think there's this interesting nexus between the environmental microbiology now and the human microbiome work. That's both of those fields have been evolving and rapidly advancing in recent years. So I think we can definitely use this knowledge, like for food security, for profit, for personal, community level benefit as well. So there's lots of ways to benefit, I hope.
Yeah, that sounds really kind of good, hopeful for the future, that we can be hopeful for the future. FDA recently approved like this microbiome treatment officially from a company. I forgot the name now. So so do you think we will have these, or how long would we be away from having this kind of treatments for different type of soils? Do you think we will be there maybe the next 5 years, 10 years? Like, how much research do we need? Let's say, you have, you're living, I don't know, in the Middle East, or you're living in Kansas or wherever, and you can predict, maybe also with better weather predictions, the weather in the next 6 months will be this way, and then you can you can manufacture maybe a cocktail for those conditions to have crop yields that are acceptable, because we have this problem currently in the US, right? That the crop yields are very, very much lower than expected, and a lot of farmers are in trouble right now. I think if they could buy such a thing to make their soil more adaptable in their crops, that I think they would do that. So, yet how long do you think we are away from a very practical application like that?
Yeah, as you're talking about precision medicine for our microbiomes in
Yes,
agricultural fields. Uh,
exactly.
yeah, no, I think that's a possibility for sure. Yeah, I think it's probably still in the 10 to 20 year time scale before it's kind of intervention, and having success with that kind of product really requires ecology is again a kind of a complicated and technical field, and we have to really think about how to use that to practical benefit. And the issue is you can't just sprinkle on microbes or communities of microbes and expect that they're going to have an impact without really understanding the limitations and the climate and the soil and the plants, the whole context of that system. So I think we can do that. It's just that we need to invest more time and effort and research in making predictions and really understanding the fundamentals of those systems, because otherwise it's just not going to work, right? Like there are microbes floating around in the environment all over the place, in the air, in water, and so they're kind of always coming in. And so if you just try to sprinkle them on in some kind of inoculum or product, or even like you think about the probiotics, there's a lot of debate about like which probiotics are actually effective. If you put some foreign microbes into your gut, what often happens is that the microbes that are pre-adapted to live there, that are already existing, they just outcompete the ones that are in the pill. And so that the similar kind of outcome could happen with soils or these agricultural uh, product mixes of microbes. But if we know, okay, well, this type of microbe has this benefit and it requires this particular ecological niche. So, like you said, maybe we know that the upcoming season is going to be particularly dry. So we know that this microbe or cocktail of microbes is helpful with dealing with drought. Then we could strategically apply that. But again, I think that kind of knowledge and that kind of practice is under development, but it's still going to be a little while before we can use it successfully.
Yeah, yeah, thank you so much. I think it would be really wonderful. Are you thinking of, did you get approached by like a precision medicine companies? There are a few in California that are focusing on genetics and so on. Are they collaborating with people to also expand into this area, or are you thinking of funding, like being a founder of a company like this, or is that something you rather give to other people to develop?
Yeah, so I have done a little bit, not much, but a little bit of consulting with agribusiness companies. Some of my colleagues are more involved, like actually making startups and such. And so I view my role as an ecologist to make sure that they are being responsible and to give my input on what I think might work and what might not work and what the challenges are going to be, so that again we're trying to align the industry goals with the societal grand challenges, and just give them advice on what I think should be the priority and what I think will work or not. So I'm not probably myself going to go out straight away and make a startup, but I am interested, and I think it is my job description and responsibility to consult and help business as well as other members of society to come up with good solutions, equitable solutions, solutions that make economic sense. And so yeah, I'll try to be responsible in my relationships with companies, but there is definitely a need for that, and I think scientists, ecologists should engage and make sure that we're moving in the right direction in industry as well.
Yeah, that's really good. So, because I think, there's a very important, those roles are all very important, and sometimes I at least trust more when those roles are kind of separate. So, for example, I would listen maybe more to David Sinclair, to what he says about aging and what maybe would help then somebody, because he stays out of funding a company exactly for the reason. So he stays independent and he can just say, new research now shows this. So then he can just say, I don't support this theory anymore and this kind of vitamins and whatever, because new research now shows this, and he can do that quite independently. So I think that is also really important. So we are very curious to follow your research and your recommendations in the future because of that. And yeah, we've been talking a little bit over an hour, so I hope we didn't, create some conflict in your schedule. But yeah, thank you so much for coming here and sharing your really important work. And thank you for doing this work. And yeah, as I said, we wish you all the best for the future, and we will be following your work. Thank you.
Thank you again for the invitation. It's great to chat here.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you everyone for coming. Also for people in the future for sending in the questions. I hope we answered them. If not, just read out to me. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed the conversation. And if you like discussions like this, just check out the calendar. We'll have a bunch more in the summer. We'll have a little bit less, especially in July, and but we have some rooms planned even in June. And thank you so much, Stephen, for doing this. And I wish you a really great weekend. So, everyone.
Thanks. Take care, everybody.
And I'll close the room in 3, 2, 1. Bye, everyone. Thank you.